Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. After coffee, we were saying we have a window of people filled with caffeine, just, the start of the session before we start getting closer to drinks and dinner. But we'll make sure that we keep you entertained so that you don't even think about dinner. Forget where you are and get lost in the content. I'm Javier Espinoza, Financial Times correspondent with the FT in Brussels. I've been there for 5 years covering competition and antitrust and digital, which it's more and more intertwined. And before that, I was with the FT here covering private equity, which is also getting more and more in the scrutiny of regulators. So lots of connections there with themes. I'll get right to it because we have a lot to cover in a limited amount of time. Each speaker will have roughly 20-25 minutes to speak, and then we'll have a couple of questions right afterwards, so just to make sure that you're all paying attention to what they say. So let me introduce Raphael Markellos from the University of East Anglia to talk about worldwide adoption of regulatory sandboxes, drivers, constraints, and policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So just press the button here. I'll use a timer this time. So I simplified the title a bit. This is a review paper. It's joint work for people from 3 organizations. So it's myself, Sean, and Bryn from the CCP. Then we have Tasos Manos and Dimitris Pazaitis from the network operator in Greece, electricity network operator in Greece. So this is HEDNO. This is a large monopoly in Greece. And then Dimitris Psychologios is the deputy or vice president for the regulator for energy, water, and waste in Greece. So this is joint work. We've been working on this project for about 3 years with Sean and others at CCP. This is part of a broader project, just to give you some context, on innovation for regulated industries. So we looked at various projects, and this is one of the action research spin-offs that we have. So I assume most of you have heard about what a regulatory sandbox is. It's a fairly new idea. It's a British idea, British affair, so it started all in London. The Financial Conduct Authority, I think in 2015, issued the first regulatory sandbox. And since then, there's been a huge increase worldwide, and this is what we're trying to investigate today. So these regulatory sandboxes it's a tool, a mechanism to promote innovation in regulated industries. Organic innovation in regulated industries doesn't really happen that easily because of there's no competition to drive innovation. So regulators thought about this idea of creating this accelerator, if you want, where they give exemptions and other support mechanisms to startups so they can help promote innovation for the benefit of the consumer and so on. I always run out of time, so I will go straight to the punchline and tell you about our findings. One of the deliverables from this project was a new database that we put together. So I'll tell you a few things how we put that together. It's available online. So if you're interested in sandboxes, you can go to the CCP website. There's a portal there, and you can download this data, and hopefully it will be useful to other researchers. So we spent a considerable amount of time looking at 92 countries and going through the web and collecting information for 199 cases. It's very, very disappointing that it was 200, so that we have to add one. And we had 3 key findings, really, from the empirical research. The first thing is that there's a very, very strong geographical concentration in the sandboxes. So there's 3 countries, the US, Singapore, and the UK, that have basically a quarter of sandboxes worldwide. So it's Pareto, if you want to, distribution of the sandboxes. The second finding is that wealthy countries are much more likely to have a sandbox. In developing and poorer countries, it is very, very unlikely that you will find regulatory sandboxes. And we talk quite a bit about that in our paper. And the final aspect the data tells us is that legal traditions seem to influence the likelihood of adoption of a sandbox. So basically, if you have common law in a country, there are higher chances that a regulatory sandbox will appear. So the practical implications of this, and I'll tell you, you have to stay awake till the end of the presentation to hear more about this. So we have two, if you want to, practical implications. I told you this is an action research project. The first one is that this lack of innovation in developing countries is something that bugged us. It annoys us a lot. So we thought about putting together some recommendations that could be possibly helpful to policymakers. So we're using Lafont's theory of regulation to draw some recommendations that may be useful in policy. The second part of the research was with the network operator in Greece, so Hedno. We helped in the design of the first corporate-led regulatory sandbox. So this tries to combine the best of both worlds. So it is, the regulator is there, it's not owned by the regulator. The regulator has an oversee, and this is owned, and operationally it is, the Hedno runs the whole sandbox. I'll tell you a few more things about that at the end. So this is an impact case in ref terms for those of you that are working for UK universities. So yeah, this is our impact, and we're quite happy and proud about it. So the data set itself, as I told you, we did a systematic research on the web using keywords and websites of regulators in countries around the world. So this took quite a lot of time. There's only 5 sandboxes before 2015, so most of them are very recent. It is a very trendy thing, especially in the European Union. Everybody nowadays wants to create a sandbox. It's a thing. Recent months, AI sandboxes is a very trendy thing to have. Identifying the sandboxes is actually quite a difficult job. Not all of them identify and have on the tin, they don't say we are a regulatory sandbox, although they have all the characteristics of a sandbox. This has also been discussed in the literature, but we certainly it created a practical problem for us in getting the data together. The vast majority have a national scope. Few of them have a regional scope or a global scope or municipal scope. And most of them, this comes as no surprise if you're in this area, are in fintech and financial innovation. So 66% are in financial services and insurance, and then you'll have energy and multi-sector as the 2 other areas. There's much more detail in the paper, but I'll just go over a few numbers. So I won't go into detail here. You can read more about this in the paper. But basically, the analysis we did of all these sandboxes, they're basically 3 dimensions, 3 design choices, if you want to, that regulators can decide on how they're going to put them together. So basically, one is the objective. So what's the objective of the sandbox? Again, the vast majority will have innovation. So the sandbox is to promote innovation. But there are other objectives, sustainability, benefit for consumers, and so on. But innovation is the main one. The second one is the benefits that participants have. Most of these will have a regulatory exemption, but this is not the rule. We do have sandboxes where there isn't any exemption, and they have network opportunities, or they'll have access to data, or they'll have support, or hosting for infrastructure and things like that. So there's a wide variety of benefits that these sandboxes offer. And the final one is governance. Again, almost all these regulatory sandboxes worldwide are owned and operated by a regulator. There's a handful, I think there's 4 cases worldwide that we found where these are operated by a private entity. The one that I'll conclude with, the one that we helped design for Hedno, is one of these. So, but it is quite different in how it operates as a corporate-led regulatory sandbox. So, the benefit of time, I'll skip this analysis here and go to some of the results. So, I told you that there's this concentration all over the world. You'll see 3 continents there that have the majority of sandboxes. And actually, if you go a bit deeper, it's only 1 country in each one of these sandboxes. So, basically, it's the US. In Europe, it is the UK and Germany to a smaller extent. And in Asia, it is Singapore. So for different reasons, we have this concentration. 37 countries have 80%, 70%, over 70% of the sandboxes worldwide. So this concentration isn't surprising for people that are working in innovation. So if you look at the innovation literature in general, we know that there is an extreme geographical innovation. So for example, the cluster research tells us that there's a geographical concentration of wealth and economic activity. So the City of London being a prime example, or Silicon Valley. So yeah, innovation likes the cluster, and geographers and economists have studied this for many, many years. Headline statistic, yeah, half of the new patents in the US are awarded to just 5 coastal states. So yeah, we know this from the innovation literature, but we confirm this here in looking at regulatory sandboxes. This was not a given. The second aspect is wealth, country wealth and regulatory sandboxes. And again, we found a very strong correlation between different aspects of economic development and the likelihood that a country develops a regulatory sandbox. So if you want to, as a percentage, so over 70% of high-income countries have at least one regulatory sandbox, whilst this percentage is only 16% for low-income countries. So there's a huge difference, over four times difference between poor countries and wealthier countries. And if you look at other statistics, so GDP, unemployment, government spending, competitiveness, all these figures tell you the same story. Economic development, with whatever metric you measure it, will have an impact on innovation, regulated innovation. The third final finding that I told you about is about legal tradition, and we find that in common law countries, again, there's a high likelihood of regulatory sandboxes. Those of you that worked with data know that all these aspects are correlated. Yes, economic development and legal system, we know from the literature that these are correlated, and geography. So yes, we control them in regression, so there is a separate effect, but nonetheless, they look at the same direction. So we've run loads of regressions. People that know me, they know that I like my econometrics and I like showing equations and regressions. I won't do that today. So I only have one table so indulge me. So yeah, this is a logic regression. So we run loads of these. So the dependent variable is regulatory sandbox adoption in a country. And we're regressing this against all our variables, metrics of economic development, dummies for legal systems, and so on. And this is a table that shows a few of these things. So yeah, positive and significant coefficient for the dummy that classifies a country as a high income. So that's the first number. Negative coefficient for if it's a low income. Basically, it's what I told you. If we put all our variables in one model, which is the one on the far right hand corner, so all the variables that we have, only 2 come out as significant, which is the competitiveness of the economy and using some international ranking system, and if it's got a civil law legal system. So these seem to approximate, to represent the effects from all the other variables. Does this come as a surprise, wealth and regulatory sandbox? No. So again, this is in line with the literature. So we know that wealthier countries have much higher levels of innovation in general. And we also know that inequality and development and innovation are all closely connected. There's also a large literature that looks at legal tradition and innovation in general. So this has been widely investigated. The thinking in the literature is that common law is more flexible, and this allows better adaptation to changes in the environment, and also investors like it better, so there's more trust by investors and so on. So I've got 6 minutes and 40 seconds, so I'm almost there. So I'll try and conclude now with our recommendations. So these are our findings, and as I said, one of the things that really annoyed us was this inequality in terms of innovation with respect to regulatory sandboxes worldwide. And we know from Akemoglu and many other economists that innovation has a significant impact on development and reducing inequality. And we also know that the regulated sector in developing countries is a large part of the economy. So if you mess it up there, it's going to have a big negative impact on the economy itself. So there's a lot of scope for impact in terms of developing countries. Now the problem is that our empirical research showed that the way that you're going to, if you want to influence the adoption of regulatory sandboxes, is going to be to influence the competitiveness of the economy or the legal system. Both of these can't really change in the short term. So you have to look at other ways to try and overcome this problem in these developing countries. So there's a really nice paper by Stache and Ren Lewis in 2009, and they use, I think it's in GEL, and they use Lafont theory of regulation to explain the limited success that regulatory reforms have in developing countries. So we take those ideas, this is a really, really nice written paper, and we adapt it to what's happening with regulatory sandboxes. So Lafont tells us that the key aspects of institutional failure in developing countries and regulatory reforms have to do with limited capacity of regulators, limited commitment, limited accountability, and limited fiscal efficiency. Just to give you some examples. So one problem which is very obvious is that regulatory sandboxes are very, very expensive, very complicated to run. You need specialized people and talent that you need to use and base this on. Just to give you some numbers, we try to find some numbers. The best we could find is that the funding will be order of magnitude of $1 million. Running expenses will be around a couple of $100,000 per year, and you need around 25 full-time people to run the regulatory sandbox. So this is not an easy thing to set up. In a developing country, it will be close to impossible. So what's the solution? What can you do? So one way is to pool sandboxes across different areas. So have a multi-utility, if you want to, regulatory sandbox. So instead of having only a sandbox about, I don't know, energy, try and have it about energy and telecommunications or water. So try and put everything together so you can use your limited resources and try and get more out of it. There's an issue of monitoring and transparency here. So if you're using local accounting standards, then this is going to be difficult to monitor and manage. So one idea there is to adopt international accounting standards and perhaps monitoring from some international agency. Limited accountability. So in developing countries, there's an issue with corruption and accountability. So again, how could we perhaps overcome this in the context of regulatory sandbox? So the idea is that here perhaps you combine many different regulators in these sandboxes, and by involving more people, perhaps that will improve transparency, and it will be more difficult perhaps to have collusion. Limited commitment. So contracts and rule of law is an issue in many developing countries, so which has to do again with the legal system. One idea that we found very, very interesting is employed by the Abu Dhabi Global Market, the ADGM. So this is an island or specific geography in Abu Dhabi where they actually have a separate rule of law, separate legal system in order to increase investment and improve trust from international investors and so on. So basically they're saying that English law is what is practiced in this specific innovation area. So if you work there, yeah, you will, everything will be trialed under English law. And this has a number of advantages, and we think that this might be a good idea for regulatory sandboxes in developing countries. And finally, I've got a couple of minutes, so limited fiscal efficiency. So there's a lack of funds in these countries. And again, Lafont's paper talks about having subsidies between rich areas in a developing country and poorer areas. Usually these are urban areas and areas in the countryside. So there could be some way of cross-subsidizing there. So finally, as I told you, one of our outcomes of this project, and this is one of the reasons why we put it together in the beginning, was that in Greece, that is not a developing country, and we have a regulator that is actually has quite a lot of resources. We thought about putting together, we proposed the idea of putting together an electricity sandbox. This was not a priority for the regulator at the time, and Dimitris Koyos is one of the co-authors, who is the regulator. There were other more pressing priorities in the country, about as it is with most countries, really. So creating a sandbox was not really realistic in the short term. But at the same time, the company itself, the network operator, was really interested in promoting innovation, developing the ecosystem, and putting together a sandbox. So the solution that we proposed, and this was launched in 2003, was to have a corporate-led sandbox, where the idea is that the regulator participates, but is just overseeing what's going on. So they have a knowledge, they're part of the meetings, they see all the activities of the regulatory sandbox, but they don't fund it, they don't put any money, they don't put a huge amount of human resources, so their involvement is limited, and they use it also for learning. So they'll understand what's going on in terms of innovation, they'll meet the stakeholders, they'll learn about the developments, and the idea is that that's my phone. So the idea is that they'll use that learning in the near future to develop the regulatory sandbox when the timing is right. So yeah, we think that this is a very interesting solution. There's a recent report, a EU report about regulatory sandbox, and yeah, this gets quite a lot of coverage, so we're very happy about that, and we're looking to develop it further. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raphael, and a very impressive use of your alarm. Really, really good. In the interest of timing, I'll take just one quick question from the gentleman. If you can introduce, say who you are, and keep the question in less than 5 seconds, just very specific.
So Faraz Bukhari from Lafra, thank you very much for the presentation. I just have one question. You showed some results about which countries are more likely to have these regulatory sandboxes and which won't. I'd be more interested in seeing which firms participate in the regulatory sandboxes versus not, because this is a test environment that is being created. And what I wonder is that even though it's a test environment, at some point the regulatory sandbox can be taken away. Does it actually lead to some sort of a first mover advantage for the firms that come in, try certain innovation, at the cost of others who couldn't participate because they were not large enough or didn't have the right thing? So does your data allow you to actually start looking at firm characteristics?
This is a great question. So very quick answer. Our next paper will be on evaluation of sandboxes and outcomes along the lines that you suggest. Unfortunately, because all these are very, very new, we still do not know the results. The KPIs that these sandboxes set are really in terms of the projects that they support and so on. We do not have any real data on outcomes. Perhaps the FCA is one exception, but for the others we don't really have a lot. In terms of the involvement of big firms, my understanding is that in majority of these large firms, kind of the oligopolies that are in these markets, are not involved. So this is almost entirely about the startups that are and the regulator that is supporting them. So I think it's the exception that some of the larger firms will be involved. They might be asked to provide data or infrastructure, but they're not directly involved, is my understanding, in terms of developing these firms. And I think this is actually one of the flaws in the system. We feel with the corporate-led sandbox, because the anchor firm is directly involved, this has a lot of benefits for the startups in the ecosystem, acquisition and so on.
Thank you so much, Raphael. Peter Ormosi at the University of East Anglia and his paper on anti-competitive algorithms.
Right, thank you very much. By the way, the EU AI Act requires member states to set up sandboxes for AI regulations. So that might kind of tilt the common law, civil law balance that you have already. But it's really interesting. So I need to start with a disclosure, especially because we have a journalist in the room. That is, I'm not at UEA right now. I work for Campus Lexecon, but this is academic research, so anything and everything I say today does not represent the views of Campus Lexecon. It's purely my own individual opinion. And the other disclosure I have to make, I recently presented this paper at a few venues, including the PSR, including Ofcom. I see some of the faces in the room. I'm afraid I've got nothing new to say in comparison to those, so you feel free to doze off or play with your phones for 20 minutes. Okay, so the reason we... sorry, I didn't say, of course, my co-author is Rahul Savani, who's a computer scientist at Liverpool and at the Alan Turing Institute. So the reason we thought that we should write this paper was that we were reading through a lot of the kind of newly emerging pieces of regulation and remedies being addressed to anti-competitive algorithms. And we were kind of thinking, well, you know, maybe there are a few things here that would be quite useful to clarify. And we kind of thought we're probably not the right people to do this, although we have an interest in this, but maybe we're not the kind of the ultimate experts in the area. Yet we thought, well, someone has to write the paper, so we thought we might as well start it. And a few months later, we've now passed 20,000 words, and we're really at risk of ending up with a monograph, which neither of us wants to do. So I'm just going to give a very slimmed down version of some of the thoughts that emerged from our work. And it is really not foundational research. This is just kind of a position paper evaluating some of the regulatory tools that we have to address the issue that in an increasing number of cases, anti-competitive outcomes can emerge from AI systems. And just one more kind of introductory point. For our terminology, we use AI systems. If you read through the regulations, or if you're familiar with the regulations, you know that typically the reference is to algorithms, and we kind of thought, you know, we need a wider approach that doesn't just look at the algorithm, which is one part of the AI system. And actually, if you read the DSA is about algorithmic systems, so it's in there with kind of the DMA list things like algorithms together with data and training related information. So we kind of really wanted to look more at the role of the entirety of the AI system. And the types of conduct, well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's really, we're kind of talking about pricing algorithms or price discovery algorithms and ranking algorithms. And mainly for ranking algorithms, we have seen cases now, and there's been remedies. It's actually already part of the nascent body of relevant regulations. So ranking algorithms are algorithms which kind of, based on data or learning from data, set up a ranking of products or services that is then presented to users. And I'm sure you've heard about cases like Google Shopping or the Trivago case in Australia or the Amazon Buy Box case are examples of this. So as I mentioned, we're talking about AI systems, and which actually includes the whole system from data collection through the writing of the algorithm and the choices related to the model architecture, then the training, which is which actually is a very large part of the process, maybe underappreciated in some of the regulatory proposals, the training and the testing, and then the deployment, the governance, the user interface. Now, all of these stages interact with each other, and there's, if there is anti-competitive outcomes that emerge from this system, it could come from any of these stages. And it's actually not even that simple, because it could be that it comes from, for example, the way the data is set up, or the sort of data that's available, but then that impact, that anti-competitive impact, is then corroborated by the other parts of the system. And individually, maybe none of these parts are designed with the kind of the anti-competitive outcome in mind. And why I'm saying this is because we think it's very important to have a distinction between what we call the design of the AI system and the outcome that emerges from this system. So under design, it's all the design considerations that go into setting up all those parts of the AI systems. And these are human considerations. So it's a human decision that goes into the design. The outcome that emerges from this system is not directly a human decision. And understanding this distinction between the two is very useful when you design algorithms. It's also useful if you want to think about the inherent information asymmetry problem, which I will come to in a few slides. And we kind of feel that there's not enough appreciation of this distinction in current regulations, and I will keep referring back to this distinction throughout my presentation. It's also important, of course, for establishing liability, and I will mention examples where the design is perfectly benign, and the designer or the developer of the AI system probably had nothing malicious in mind, yet what emerges from a given design ends up being anti-competitive. And of course, foundation models make it even more complex. Foundation models can be used in a very general setting. So as opposed to kind of specific purpose AI, general purpose AI, the way the supply chain works is that the developer develops these models, and then it's sold downstream to a business which then deploys the model. Very often a business has no understanding, understandably actually, no understanding about the details of what went into the foundation model. They just buy the right, for example, to use an API. Again, how do you establish liability in this sort of setting? It's even more complex. So a few general points for regulation. The one is, and this is probably the main one, information asymmetry. So this is a core problem in regulated markets, and one of the main reasons we have regulations, and we've decided to regulate certain markets. And the different types of solution proposed to this problem, incentive contracts or setting up some sort of incentive mechanism to reduce the information asymmetry, things like transparency requirements or disclosure requirements work well in some settings. But the question is, do they work just as well for AI systems? And we believe it's not entirely the case. And to understand this, we thought it's very useful to distinguish between two layers of transparency and two layers of kind of the information asymmetry problem. The first level is what we call visibility. And visibility is having access to the information. So if you think about traditional regulation, utility regulation, some of the, or many of the problems could be eliminated by giving access to all the information. And there might be an assumption that if there is information asymmetry between the regulator and the regulated firm, if the regulator had access to all information, they could make an informed decision. Some of it might be true for AI systems, but a large chunk of how AI systems work means that actually a lot more happens at the second level of information, and that is the explainability dimension of the information. So having access to all the information is not the same as being able to explain all that information. And even within this second level of explainability of the information, we can distinguish between two levels. One is the understanding of what went into the design of the system, and even understanding the link, the causal link between that design decision and the outcome. And the final layer, where you actually have an understanding of the mechanism of the AI system, the technical understanding. And we argue throughout the paper that this information asymmetry is so inherent and so much more intensive in the case of AI systems that some of the regulatory tools that are being or have been proposed won't work. So another thing, and as I mentioned, it's a long paper, so I'm really just picking out some of the bits which I think are most interesting. Another thing which is important to bear in mind is a kind of more general, in a more general setting, is the understanding of the inherent trade-offs that are in AI systems, trade-offs between explainability and accuracy, between fairness and accuracy. And these have got an immense body of computer science literature that show that these are actually real trade-offs. And therefore, when you want to regulate these systems, you need to be aware of these trade-offs. And these trade-offs actually link quite directly to the two principles of regulation, the effectiveness and proportionality principles. That you can, and it also links to kind of type 1, type 2 error trade-off. You can try to be more and more effective, but of course at some point you are then sacrificing too much and making the regulation disproportionately burdensome on the regulated firm. Right, so for the next 10 minutes I'm going to talk about the toolkit, and this is the toolkit that currently exists in regulation. And especially focusing on non-discrimination requirements. And the reason why is because this is something that is already part of regulation, the DMA or the DSA, even in the AI Act, you can find it, or the DMCC, you can find examples of this. And it's also something that has been used as an ex post remedy in specific cases. For example, in Google Shopping, where it was required that Google apply some sort of non-discrimination approach to the way suppliers are ranked. So given the information asymmetry, it kind of makes sense to impose a non-discrimination requirement and maybe take a step back and see how the operator of the AI system deals with it. And this is actually what the European Commission did in Google Shopping. They required non-discrimination, but they left the details to Google. And there are some opinions that maybe it didn't work out so well. To demonstrate why this is actually a really tricky thing, I'm going to give you a very simple hypothetical example. And in this example, we have an intermediation platform which wants to present suppliers or products to customers. And it's kind of, you can think of it as a very simple ranking algorithm. Now, we're making everything simple, and this is a very hypothetical example for demonstrational purposes. So, for example, we apply that the only thing the algorithm has to do is to select which businesses to or which suppliers to show to the customer. And we also simplify things by saying, well, the operator of the algorithm or the AI system only knows two things about each supplier: their delivery speed and their delivery price. And now imagine that we have one group of suppliers that subscribe to some sort of premium membership scheme. And it's very similar to, for example, the Amazon fulfillment network that Amazon has for suppliers. And it's, being part of the AFN, for example, means that your delivery speed is probably going to be faster because you are allowed to store your things in Amazon warehouses and so on and so on. The other thing we have here is that there are different types of customers, of course, sorry. And of course, customers have preferences for these suppliers. They like some of them, they don't like the other ones. But the platform or the operator of the AI system doesn't know which one's which and which ones are the suppliers that they should be showing. Now, imagine that this is, again, it's a really simple setup. And so the only thing that platform has to do is kind of try to estimate from this data, okay, which ones to show. And in this case, it would be actually a really simple kind of linear decision tool that would nicely separate out most of the pluses, most of the suppliers that the customers would like, and you would just show them. Now imagine there's another set of suppliers that don't subscribe to this, premium scheme. And as a result, they tend to have higher delivery prices and higher delivery speed. However, consumers like more of these. So there's a larger proportion of these that consumers like. Now, the operator of the AI system doesn't know why, doesn't have data on this. But it could be, for example, these are greener products or whatever other reason. Again, there's a very simple decision tool that the operator could apply here, and that would predict exactly which ones to show. Again, it's a simple setup. Now imagine that, the other difference here is that there's a lot more data on the premium suppliers, which is very often the case in discrimination cases. And remember, this is about anti-discrimination or non-discrimination requirements, is that you have less data on the discriminated group. So, okay, now there's a decision that requires the platform to disregard the information on whether a supplier is part of the premium scheme or not. As a result, the platform has to estimate on the entirety of the data what is the decision rule that makes as few mistakes as possible. Now, because we had the simple setup of having more data on the red firms, if we bring all this data together, the decision rule would be something like this, and therefore we'd end up not recommending most of the businesses that did not prescribe or to subscribe to the premium scheme. So this is, again, it's a very simple reason why we have this is because of data availability. What we require, on the other hand, just having no discrimination, again, it seems like the right thing to do. What we end up with is not the optimal outcome. Now, of course, the operator of the platform knows this, and they can easily do, when there's a change their policies, to run some A/B tests in-house, and they will see, hey, we're not recommending the other guys, but we don't have to worry about this because we're doing what we've been asked to do. So we go through 3 similar examples in the paper to show why this is a really difficult task. And we do very simple and similar kind of examples for transparency requirements as well in the paper. And I only have about 90 seconds left. So I'm just going to move to what we think might work here. So first of all, because of this extremely severe information asymmetry problem that we have in the market and related to AI systems, that putting the regulator in a driving seat doesn't seem like a good idea. The kind of the traditional utility regulation type incentive regulations do not really fit well with digital markets. And there are many reasons why Jean Tirole actually gave the first two of these on our list. What we're adding to this is, of course, the problem that that bad outcome can emerge from good design. And very often these things are not considered in the way we think about incentive mechanisms. So what might work is, of course, it's probably a lot more drastic, is that we don't think there is much point in putting the regulator in a driving seat. Maybe we have to turn the table. Maybe we have to say, well, should we think about strict liability and say, well, if something bad happens, we cannot really evaluate whether and where this kind of thing originates from, because the system is so complex. But that's why we require strict liability, and therefore the operator of the AI system has to demonstrate if something bad had happened, that it wasn't due to malicious design, or there has to be some sort of level of what are considered as a reasonably prudent operator, and whether that duty of care has been observed by this operator, and so on. So I'm on the concluding side. We're not sure, of course, we're not lawyers, so kind of saying that strict liability is the only solution, it would probably sound too harsh coming from us. We just know that the other things we don't think work the way maybe some regulators think they do work. And I'm just going to finish up with an example. So this was in 2010. There was something called a flash crash. And a flash crash, if you haven't heard about it, was a collapse of the American stock market. And so what happened with the flash crash was within 30 minutes, there was an extreme amount of money, trillions of dollars were wiped out of the stock market. And the reason why was because there was algorithmic trading, high-frequency trading happening in the market. But sorry, I shouldn't have said the reason why. But that was just the background. Now, the regulators came in after the flash crash and started looking at it and tried to establish what went wrong. The regulators had access to all the data. They had access to all the logs. And they spent years. Academics, the best academics, spent years studying this problem, what caused the flash crash. And there's still no consensus. Of course, some people were sent to prison, but there's still no consensus what caused it. Because the system itself is so complex, it's really difficult to analyze. Now, a lot more money in that case was thrown at the problem than what you would have in the typical setup of a competition authority looking into, or a simple competition regulator looking into a simple case. And yet we didn't have answers. So we kind of we feel that maybe we shouldn't be so optimistic that these are currently proposed regulatory tools are effective. And I'll stop here, and I apologize, I exceeded my time. Thank you.
Excellent. Let's open the floor for a couple of questions. Very interesting, Peter. Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. The gentleman there, can you please say your name and keep the question very brief?
My name is Jens Prüfer. I'm in Tilburg and at the Center for Competition Policy. Very brief question, because you kind of point a lot at the information asymmetry. I mean, I guess the underlying assumption is first that the creator of the AI system knows more than the regulator. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more here. And secondly, I mean, we distinguish between all kinds of information asymmetry, in particular between hidden types and hidden action. I think you're referring to hidden action, hence have moral hazard in the back of your mind, where then an incentive contract, in theory, can solve the problem. But I'm not really sure whether this is whether the AI system as a whole could not have a specific type, which kind of it cannot change over time. And then you need different technologies like screening and signaling, which can solve that problem. Sorry, very theoretical question.
Yeah. Can I answer? Okay.
Of course.
So, yeah, sorry, I wasn't clear. I was rushing through the slides. So, yes, information asymmetry. What's tricky here is that it's not only with AI system, it's not only that the operator of the system knows it and the regulator doesn't know it. The problem is very often even the operator of a system doesn't know it. And we just wanted to argue that it's very difficult to expect that just because we identified an outcome that's not desirable for whatever reason, we can look at it and we can analyze it and we'll find a reason and then we can offer a solution. So in that information asymmetry, of course, we were focusing, in the paper we have more time to elaborate on, the different levels. So the things like information asymmetry between the user or the consumer and the firms, information asymmetry between the regulator and the regulated firms. And of course, different issues emerge in these different situations. So maybe I didn't do a very good job kind of highlighting the main point here, but it's more about the distinction between having access to the information and being able to interpret it or explain it that matters here. And we just think that sometimes it isn't as simple. And maybe I'll give another example from finance. Anyone in the room heard about Knight Capital? So Knight Capital was, I don't know, it might still exist, was one of the major trading companies in the US, trading with equities. In 2012, they were using a high-frequency trading algorithm, and they updated their algorithm. They've updated it before many times. Now, this update required a human, or a set of humans, to be in charge of things, and then the update had to be uploaded on various servers. And there was a human error. Someone didn't spot that there was something somewhere in the code, line 255. As a result, they lost billions within a matter of minutes, which some of it they recovered, but they still ended up losing about $500 million. Knight Capital, I have to emphasize, at the time was the largest equity trading company. They knew what they were doing, and I'm sure they were trying to do the best they could do to avoid problems like this happening, and they couldn't. And that's why we think someone who sits on the other side of the table, who doesn't even have that understanding, we think that, well, giving them more transparency, giving them access to the logs, giving them access to the training data, we just feel it's not going to help because it's too much. Sorry, a really long-winded answer.
Excellent, very, very interesting. Thank you so much. And I know from my dealings with the Commission and the Google shopping case, the jury is still out on this information asymmetry, and I certainly get a lot of calls from rivals to Google that, on this information asymmetry. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out. Okay, thank you so much. And now our final presentation by Tim Salmon from the Southern Methodist University on dynamic reserve prices in procurement.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and I did change the title, so just to pick you up. So thanks for the invitation to come across the ocean and talk to you guys for a bit. So you might see how I got the invitation given my co-authors. While I'm not with the CCP, all of them are. So it's been a nice trip over here and see a bit of a different type of work. This paper is part of a couple paper project looking at some issues in design of procurement auctions. So this is going to be less of a high-level overview of competition policy and more looking at some specific issues about how to encourage specific types of competition. So the general overview of the type of issue that we're looking at here deals with procurement auctions. And there are a lot of different examples of when certain entities need to procure basically the same item or service many, many times over time. So you might have an organization that needs to procure janitorial service in 1 year, and then they need to do it again the next year, and next year, and next year. Or catering services, other things that they'll need to do over time. And you want to do this in a cost-effective way, and one of the ways that people try to minimize their prices is through some sort of procurement auction, some sort of low-price procurement auction where you try to find the lowest cost vendor and use the existence of multiple different vendors to drive competition to keep the prices low. Okay. But there's a problem with this when you think about this existing over time, and it stems from the possibility that provider costs might be somewhat persistent over time, okay? So if you run an auction once and you find the lowest cost provider out there, and then the next year you want to run the auction again, might very well be the lowest cost provider again, especially again if there's cost persistence across time. And this is a particular problem because not only does that supplier know that they are probably the lowest cost provider, but all of their competitors know that they can beat their price too. So why did the competitors want to show up to the auction the second year? Okay, so in these types of environments, what you can have is perhaps an initial year or two of very competitive auctions, keeping your prices low, but then slowly competitors stop showing up. When the competitors stop showing up, your prices are likely to tend to rise. So the overarching question that we're trying to get at is how do you design a procurement process that can encourage this competition among suppliers over time in the presence of these persistent costs? Okay, so we had this came out of a specific example of pharmaceutical procurement auctions in the Philippines. So in the 90s, the Philippines decided that each different local hospital area and government, as you see on the map over here, should start procuring their own drugs for their regions. And they started running a lot of procurement auctions for these drugs. At some point, people started noticing, wait, why are the prices so high? We don't like this. We want to do something, try to push the prices down. We want to try to do something to encourage competition. And in 2014, the commission decided to impose a new rule for these auctions in the form of a dynamic bid cap. All right, so what the dynamic bid cap, the basic way it operated, is that in any particular year, they would look at the prices that that particular drug sold for across all regions in the year before, and no one was allowed to bid more than the median winning bid from the previous year, okay? And so the idea is to sort of make certain that prices can't go back up, they can't go too high, right? So finding out exactly why they impose this is always sometimes difficult with certain regulators. But one can tell a lot of stories about why this type of regulation might be effective. So one issue is that for those who do or don't know much about auction theory, there's a long literature on how to optimally set reserve prices. And as a specialist in the area, what I can tell you is it's really complicated. It's really complicated, and in order to do it properly, you need to have a lot of information that you don't have, okay? So this could be seen as sort of a shortcut way to get you to quasi-optimal reserve prices, thinking that, well, last year people were on average able to provide this for, in this case, 150 Philippine pesos. Well, this year, why couldn't they do the same? And why should we accept a higher price this year than people were able to do it at last year? it might be a reasonable shortcut. You can also think of this, so Walmart is, of course, famous for their own procurement policies of trying to keep prices low, and they always impose these policies every year. Every supplier must cut costs by 10%. This year, everyone must cut prices by 15%. And this can work very well for a company like Walmart, because if they find a supplier that can't meet that, they've got 1,000 others to provide more stuff to go on their shelves. Maybe it might not work so well in the drug procurement context. We'll see that. But again, you could think of this as a way to try to put in some sort of cost controls like this that, at least in some cases, seem to be effective. Another possibly very important use for this is the fact that there might be some areas where the bidding is quite competitive, you get quite low costs, but then there are other, perhaps rural areas where not very many suppliers want to go and provide the drugs out to those areas, and so you might not get very much competition out there. By tying the bid cap to the overall winning prices, what you're essentially doing is taking the competition that's in those highly competitive areas and pushing it out to help you regulate prices out in those less competitive areas. All of these things seem like good reasons to adopt a bid cap. They're great stories, but I'm an economist, so I have many hands. And so it turns out that there's some potential problems with these types of regulations. So here's a couple of them. So a main issue is that when you try to harvest that competition in one area and push it out somewhere else, it's entirely possible that suppliers, no one can actually provide that drug at that cost out in those rural areas. And if you do that, what happens, right? This isn't Walmart. You can't just decide not to have statin drugs out in the rural areas. You've got to get them. So you have a commitment problem. And the commitment problem is that what happens when they would do this in the Philippines auctions is they would just say, oh, no one wanted to bid. Yeah, we're going to redo this auction in a while. Exactly the rules for how to redo this, they're not very specific. But basically it means they're going to get rid of the bid cap for the re-auction. This leads to all sorts of renegotiation problems. It leads to problems of companies possibly withholding their supply to try to get the bid cap lifted, which might work against it. There's also a problem that, let's say I'm a very large supplier. I know that my bids might be able to determine future bid caps. If I know that my bid is going to determine future bid caps, I might not want to tie myself to low prices in the future. So again, I might restrict some of my supply to try to keep the prices from going too low so that I don't tie myself to bid caps in the future. Third, if there's some sort of cost risk, so there's the possibility of costs rising in the future, again, I'm going to hedge against that future risk. I'm not going to bid very competitively this time to try to not tie myself down to this. So I have stories that say it's good. I have stories that say that it's bad. Stories are great, but data's better. So what can we get out of data? So the paper I'm presenting to you now is our second paper in this. Our first paper in this goes through and tries to figure out, well, what actually happens in the Philippines auctions? The answer is, you can see it's complicated. The reason it's complicated is because data that we get out of these auctions is not very good. We basically only observe the prices in any particular region. We can't get data on the actual auctions. So we don't know how many bidders are involved. We don't know what the losing bids were. Technically, we don't even observe the failed auctions. What we observe is when a price that the drugs are sold for or procured for is above what the bid cap is. Well, what's the only reason that could have happened? That the auction failed and they had to redo it. We don't observe that an auction failed, they got rid of the bid cap, but then there was enough competition to drive it back down below the bid cap. So I'm going to show you some estimates about how often they failed, but these are underestimates, and in just a second you'll see why that's an important point. And so, we can observe things, but it's going to be difficult to say too much about them. So what do we find? Well, the good news is that after the bid cap was imposed in 2014, take the drug prices before, you take the drug prices after, up to 2019, prices fell by 11 to 13%. That's suggestive that the bid caps were effective. But what's the problem? By our estimates using this approach we have, we find that 1 in 3 of the auctions failed. That's a lot. That's a huge recontracting cost, because you've got to, I mean, there's a lot of drugs, a lot of, to run these things over a lot of districts. That's a lot of auctions to have to redo on sort of idiosyncratic basis. So that's potentially an issue. The problem with the field data is that it's difficult to know whether or not this drop in prices had anything to do with the bid cap. It could have been because more competitors were coming into these markets. It could have to do with prices falling. It could have to do with a lot of things which we can't observe out of this data. So what we're going to do, in what we did in this paper, is we decided to conduct an experiment to try specifically to understand what are the impacts of this specific auction institution. In particular, what we're trying to identify is, between those different stories, which of those stories tends to be active in terms of driving actual bidder behavior when they're faced with this dynamic bid cap mechanism, okay? So this is going to be an economic experiment where we're going to bring people in, put them through these mechanisms, and see how they would actually bid. And so we want to understand whether or not when you tie prices over time, does it actually lead to people learning to bid less aggressively, right? One of the problems with doing that is that there's an implicit, essentially, social dilemma among the bidders, which is that if I recognize that I should pull back from bidding aggressively, he recognizes he should. Peter says, I'm going to bid aggressively anyway. Doesn't matter. So we basically need all of the bidders involved to figure this out. In order to do that, there's indications, of course, that many times people learn to do things like this. So it's possible that people would figure this out. We also want to understand whether or not this bid cap mechanism has a tendency to drive these market failures, and how often it's likely to happen, both due to tying the prices over time due to the cost risks, as well as tying the prices across jurisdictions, and whether or not that's going to lead to a lot of failed auctions. Okay, so what are we going to do? So in this case, we designed a multi-round experiment where we're basically going to mimic what happens in these procurement auctions in a controlled setting, where we're going to bring in people, train them how to bid in these auctions, train them how it works, give them financial incentives to do the best they can to make the most money they can in these auctions. And they were all run in the Philippines with local people. Which makes sense given the context. And so what we would do is we would take people, groups of 5 at a time, let them participate in 3-round auction sequences where we impose these dynamic bid caps over those different rounds. And then we would allow them to get experience. We let them go through 10 sequences of this so that they could hopefully learn over time how to improve their earnings and possibly learn some of these strategic manipulations of the market. So the way it works is that in round 1 of each sequence, all 5 bidders are involved in the auction. They all bid. They see the outcome from this, and in rounds 2 and 3, they get to decide, do I want to participate? If they participate, they're going to have to pay a 2 ECU cost. If they don't want to participate, they get to play a fun game. If this were an experimental conference, I would talk more about the methods for that, because it's fun. You can ask me about the dino game later. So the idea is to make certain that people aren't just entering these auctions just for the heck of it. In the field auctions, it's certainly costly to participate in them, so we want to make certain they are here. So the way we operationalize these auctions is each seller in the sequence is going to have some fundamental cost draw from some range of 100 to 200. In each round, they're going to have some cost risk, right? So every round, their actual cost is going to fluctuate around this, but we're going to give them another idiosyncratic draw from negative 15 to 15 to add to this. And so that means that in the first round, it turns out I might have the lowest cost. I might not have the lowest cost in the second round. I might not have the lowest cost in the third. On the other hand, I might find out I don't have the lowest cost in the first round, but I could have the lowest cost in the second. And there's also this risk that I could agree to a price in this round that next round I won't be able to supply out anymore, okay? So this cost risk we think is important for this context, and so we wanted to make certain that it's, that it was in there. All right, so we're going to run this experiment under 3 different regimes, one with no bid cap, so it'll be just that mechanism, no bid cap. We're going to run a second treatment called a single market bid cap. In this case, the bid cap in round 2 is going to be equal to what the winning bid was in that market in round 1. So it's going to be a very strict version of the Philippines dynamic bid cap. It's very strict to make it very clear to whoever's going to win that not only will you be determining your price for this round, you will be determining your maximum price next round. So think very carefully what you want to do. Then we also have a version which we call the multi-market bid cap. In this case, all we're going to do is make the bid cap for one of these groups of 5 based upon the auction outcome from one of the other groups in the previous round. In this case, it makes it clear to the bidder that they have no control over the bid cap. It's set by someone else. It's set by the cities, and I'm bidding in the rural areas. I can't control it. Okay, so since I'm an economist, I got to show you I can do some fancy math. If you want to see, we can derive optimal bid functions here. There's some complicated stuff there, whatever. We don't really need to go through that. We can look at the bid from this, and from thinking through the theory here, we can think of some predictions of what we think we might see in these different treatments. In the no bid cap case, what we expect to see is exactly the story I opened with, which is that in the first round, we get a lot of competition. Prices should be relatively low. After that, the bidders who have the relatively high costs should realize, I'm not going to be able to compete with these people. I'm going to drop out and go do something else. Some bidders might stay in. There might be a little competition, but it's very likely that competition will fall and prices will rise over time. And of course, there's no bid cap to lead to closed out markets, so that shouldn't happen. When we look at the single market bid cap mechanism, multiple possibilities. One is that they learn to pull back their supply. So they learn, I don't want to bid very aggressively and tie myself down to the future. Or they might fail to do that. And if they fail to do that, then there's the possibility that we have some auctions getting closed due to the cost risk. With the multi-market bid cap, sellers know that their bids can't drive the bid cap, so we shouldn't see any change in bidding behavior from the no bid cap case. But here we have the possibility of markets getting closed out due to bid caps from other markets. Okay, so I can show basically all of the results off of this slide. I'll show you some more pretty pictures and things after that, especially since some of these numbers are a little bit difficult to see. But basically what we can see is in the no bid cap case, in round 1, the average price is around 117. In round 2, it goes up to 127, and in round 3, it goes up to 148, right? Exactly what we expected. So prices are going to start low when there's a lot of competition. That's because we had 5 bidders per round, but the number of bidders drops as we go into rounds 2 and 3, and the prices go up, right? This is exactly what the motivating story here, and not surprisingly, we find exactly what we expected there. And virtually no failed auctions. There's like 1 or 2%. Decimal dust doesn't really matter. If we look at the single market bid cap case, in the first round, well, the price is around 120, basically the same as it was here, and the price actually falls, which is good. That's essentially what you find in the field. But what else do we find? Even in this single market bid cap case, by round 3, 60% of our markets are failing. What's happening is that these bidders are bidding so aggressively, they're closing themselves out of being able to actually supply in future periods. That's a problem. In the multi-market bid cap case, again, first round price is 120. It drops below that in rounds 2 and 3. Again, that's good news until we see that 70% of our markets are getting closed out from this bid cap. Okay, so basically what we can do with these experiments is we can essentially replicate the same stylized results that we got from the field auctions, but now we can understand exactly why these things are happening. So we can show that there's going to be at least some of these auctions that are getting closed out simply due to cost risk of firms not being able to supply at the cost they could have in the past. And there's also likely to be a lot that's caused by, there might be some very efficient suppliers in other regions, but in these regions, those efficient suppliers don't exist. And once you have that, you're going to get things closed out. One important thing, this is one of the other quasi-pretty pictures that I can show. So this gray line here is what the equilibrium bid should be about from suppliers in the first round if they don't take into account any of the dynamic considerations. And what we find is that in all three treatments, there are lots of different colored lines and different colored dots indicating bids and regression lines through them, which you can make out if there is any difference between them. There's not. What that's indicating is that people are not pulling back their supply due to strategic concerns. They're just bidding very aggressively, and that's what's causing all of the closeouts. So in rounds 2 and 3, weird things happen to the bids, especially in these graphs due to selection bias of people dropping out. So I showed you some summary statistics. I could take you through a lot of regression tables showing you that all of those things are significant as we expected, but I'm being told I only have 2 minutes. So I'm going to skip all those. If you want to see them later on, they'll be in an eventual paper. Another important point here is if we look at how much money the actual bidders in these auctions were making, in the no bid cap case, they were making, about 25 of these currency units per auction. They're losing in the bid cap cases, right? If you have a procurement mechanism that's causing systematic losses among your suppliers, what's going to happen over time? No one's going to supply. And that's what these bid caps are doing. They're driving the prices so far down that people are going to drop out. And once they've dropped out, again, you can't just say forget them. You've got to go back to the no bid cap auctions, which is eventually going to have your prices rise. Okay, so small detail. If we look at the entry decisions of our subjects in terms of entering into the auctions, one of the things we find is if you think that you propose a simple rule that they should stay in the auction anytime their current cost is less than the bid cap, you shouldn't actually follow that in round 2 because there's some risk. If your cost is slightly above that, it might drop in the next round, so you might stay in. But by round 3, there's no reason to stay in, and we get very sharp decision line making exactly as we would expect. So it's evidence that these people are making very intelligent decisions, very strategic and thoughtful ones, even though they don't seem to be able to figure out the supply restriction strategy, or at least effectively enough to pull it back. Okay, so what we find is that in this laboratory experiment, we can replicate the field data, and it helps us understand those field results. And what we find is that prices seem to drop, at least in the auctions you can actually conduct. And then we have all of these failed auctions, which presumably with that amount of them, this is going to be a substantial recontracting cost that leads to a lot of inefficiency, a lot of extra headache for all the bidders, a lot of headache for all of the auctioneers. And so this paper is essentially a start of a slightly longer research project trying to figure out, can we do better? What sort of better procurement mechanism can we design to come up with this? We have some thoughts that we're working on. While this seems to be a very fundamental problem that a lot of entities would have, one of the things that we're surprised about is we can't find a lot of existing solutions to this. If this turns out to be incorrect and any of you know of some good existing solutions, come tell me. We'd be happy to find out about it. About the only existing solutions that we really know about are some things that the US Defense Department does to make certain that there are multiple defense contractors around, but those mechanisms won't work as is for this context. So we have some thoughts on some things to design, and next time one of us presents this paper, hopefully you will see them presented and see them working. But I will go ahead and stop there because I think I am just about exactly out of time. All right.
Excellent, great. Let me just check if there's any questions from the audience before we start our next panel. Could you wait for the microphone to reach you? Say who you are and keep the question very short.
Without the microphone, I can also say I have the right incentive to keep it short, given I'll be eating into my own time. So it's always nice when it's
Very good incentive. Yeah.
Microphone for the people online.
I know this was a humorous comment. That waiting might be very short. So when you have to say something humorous, it's not funny enough.
I thought it was funny.
Thank you. Sean needed an explanation, so Sean didn't. Simon Wilde, Oxera. So UK experience of tendering for offshore wind capacity, which is a reverse auction, tells us that our failure rate is 1 in 5. So AR5 failed. I'm sure you've looked at it. I think there is a solution because, which is applying common sense. And the UK government failed to apply common sense, and as a result, AR5 failed. And in other words, if the cost curve is understandable and explicable, and there's been a movement in the cost curve, you can apply expert judgment to move your bid upwards. And this was in my humble opinion, an obvious remedy that the government chose not to do because it involved making a commercial judgment, which the public sector finds very hard to do.
Sure. So, I mean, to the extent that you can get good information about the costs and then you can get people to actually supply at those costs, that could do it. So my own bias is hope to let the market determine that, and as opposed to the government dictating prices. But that might be a way to at least drive a different approach to a bid cap, of understanding how the costs vary in different areas.
As a consultant, I like expert input.
Simon, just a quick
follow-up.
Can you please say who you are?
Oh, sorry, Kuhn. I think I was before. No, just a quick follow-up. I mean, essentially, this is a very sophisticated form of yardstick competition. And if you don't have costs in yardstick competition, you have the same problem, don't you?
There's one more. Quick.
Can you wait for the microphone?
Yes.
There you go. Please say who you are and keep the question short.
Hello, congratulations. I'm from University College of Dublin, and I have a question about the applicability of your model to the day-ahead market in the energy exchange model. So the energy crisis was recent, and mainly one of the reasons that has been presented was the dependency of the European Union from the Russian gas. But I'm wondering, apart from the cost factor and the marginal cost approach that the European Union, after the recent energy market reform, keeps promoting, do you consider that a model like that could be efficient in the interaction between day-ahead market and intraday market in order to control the cost?
So what market?
Between the day-ahead market and the intraday market.
Of what?
About the cost of the damn prices at the end of the day, because according to the latest decision of ACER regulator, there is so many manipulative practices in the intraday market at the end of the day, which has to do with the cost and the relation of the cost between the two markets, the day ahead and the intraday market. So I'm wondering if this model would be applicable in order to control the cost with this auction bid procedure in this relation between these two markets.
So I'll admit I don't know exactly, I'm not as familiar with the details of that marketplace, but this is a daily market for spot prices every day. My guess is that this will not be a good match for that type of environment, simply due to a lot of differences in how things might change day to day for different things. But you know, there are different models to deal with those that I think would work better than this. All right.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Can I invite the next three panelists, please, on stage? And thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much, and thanks for sticking here with us. We have about 25 minutes of discussion, and this will definitely wake you up because we're going to talk about a very interesting subject, one that's close to my heart as a journalist dealing with regulators and tech companies in Brussels. The big question is technology is moving way faster than regulators can write the rules. And the criticism often goes that, by the time you finish with the DMA or you finish with the AI Act, the incumbents have already cornered markets and have already captured everything. Just today I published something on Microsoft and, the fears that, they're in a market where the winner takes all in the second wave of innovation with AI now. But first of all, let me introduce my panelists. To my left, Helen Weeds from the Center for Competition Policy. Eleftheria Kostika, I hope I say it correct. Correct. Very good. My time with Greek people has paid off really well. From the Bank of Greece. And Simon Wilde at Oxera.
Correct.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So let's just start, first of all, with a very generic question, which is this idea of change and the mindset. After all, regulators are people with their own worldviews, with their own way of thinking, the way of doing things, and they are captured in an environment, in an institution. And cultural change is difficult because personal change is difficult. I don't know about you, but the longer I'm alive, the more I'm setting my ways. So, and the same, I think, goes with regulators. So, Simon, let's start with you on this broad theme before we zoom in on different aspects of emerging regulation that regulators are trying to capture. What are some big sweeping thoughts?
Thank you for that. And prior to joining Oxera, I was at Ofgem for 4 years, latterly sitting on the executive committee and dealing with the energy crisis. And so we had change thrust upon us. We also, the first half of my time at Ofgem, we chose to thrust change onto the sector. So we saw the two directions of change, and we had COVID in the middle as well. And change is hard. This is the first thing I'd say. I think change is hard anyway, and I think change is particularly hard for public sector organizations. There are public sector constraints, but also the more self-reflective you are as a person or as an organization, the easier it is to change. And my experience of the public sector is we're often not terribly self-reflective. I think change requires incentives, and we should ask ourselves the question: do we promote people because they're really good at policy, or do we promote because they're good at leadership? So there's something about incentives and institutional culture as well. But I just think we recognize it is hard. Most change management programs fail.
In order to be successful, do you need something like COVID or the energy crisis to?
So it's a cliche to say don't waste a crisis. But actually that's also very true in the public sector. There's so much inertia that sometimes a crisis lets you change. At Ofgem, we pivoted our entire approach to regulating the retail sector. I think we made some decisions that were the right decisions that we could have, and actually, according to a report written by Oxera, should have changed sooner. So it did help change, but it came at a human cost. Our attrition rates went up, for example. I took a 6-month sabbatical because I was exhausted. I didn't go back. Mixed views, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for Ofgem, but it is hard, and hence me saying change is hard.
Eleftheria, how did you feel it, or how did you see, or how do you engage with change as regulators, as the mindset and this changing culture?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the CCP board for inviting me to be here today and to exchange some my views from the central bank perspective, because Bank of Greece is a national bank of Greece and is part of the Euro system and part of the European Central Bank. Because Simon talked about hot, I came from the very warm Athens. We have a very hard heat wave, and to enjoy the coolness of London.
People who live here don't see it like that. But, yeah.
So briefly, I would like to make 4 points on your question. The first one is that it's essential for central banks to monitor all this technological and financial transformation, because all this business innovation can lead to new business model that will transform all the financial services. And finally, the way we, all of us, transact, all the users and the public. My second point is about Bank of Greece, how it proceeds with all this financial transformation. So we have implemented 2 tools, the FinTech Innovation Hub and a regulatory sandbox that Raphael Markellos talked about it, and I can give you more information afterwards.
Yeah.
And my third point is regarding the opportunities and risks that create all this financial transformation. But what I would like to highlight is that this financial transformation is not something new. We can go back to 19th century with the initiation of cash dispensing machine, credit card and MasterCards. But what it changed today, and I agree with Salmon, is the speed of change that has accelerated during COVID and after that. So there is an ongoing digitalization. We have big data platforms. We have digital new products, financial products like crypto, stable coins. So the regulators have to do not stifle innovation, but ensure also the protection of all the stakeholders and the financial stability. And my last point is how central banks react to all this financial transformation. So we have the rise of crypto markets, and we have also the surge of digital payments, the electronic money. These, I think, 2 factors have motivated all the central banks to consider the concept of cash and to examine the potential issues of their own digital currency, the central bank digital currency that we have talked about it or we have listened to it.
Lots of points to flesh out. Lots of information. But one very interesting thing, you talked about speed.
Yes.
And I saw it firsthand, when the regulators were drafting the AI Act, they had to quickly rewrite it with ChatGPT coming into the scene. So quite interesting. Helen.
So just to sort of add to the introduction, I was until very recently senior advisor at the Payment Systems Regulator, so some of the topics I'll discuss come from that. Prior to my 2.5 years there, I was heavily involved in the communications sector, so I may refer to that a little bit as well, just to give you the background. So, I mean, the PSR is quite interesting in that one of its objectives is explicitly innovation. So, I mean, there are 3 key objectives. There's competition, innovation, and the interests of service users. I mean, those often run together in that we tend to think competition benefits service users, and innovation generally can be very positive for users. I think this raises challenges for the regulator, and we certainly saw this at the PSR. I mean, in a fast-moving sector where there's a lot of technology, it's very important. It's challenging for the regulator to keep up with that and understand what's going on. But I think any innovation presents both opportunities and threats. So, I mean, Eleftheria has mentioned 1 or 2 which overlap with some of the things that the PSR was, and I'm sure still is, thinking about. I mean, CBDC, digital currencies, primarily a Bank of England concern, but the PSR put in its response to the consultation last year, highlighting the additional factors that need to be thought about with CBDC as a retail payment method. If you're really going to go down that track, there are additional factors that need to be thought about, and the PSR is well placed to help with those. I mean, consumer protection being one, the practicalities of how a retail system, payment system works for retail settings and so on. Another one, I mean, AI, which has already been touched on in this session, offers huge scope for improvements to payment systems. Much of that is going on. The private players are doing all of that. So, I mean, this is more an area for perhaps horizon scanning, keeping an eye on, working out what's going on. But there are particular areas of concern. Fraud is a very, very major concern in payments. AI is increasingly being used in that area by the fraudsters. There are perhaps ways that the regulator can help incentivize anti-fraud measures, which can also harness the power of AI to try and do a better job. So, I mean, the regulator has a major job to do, quite a challenging job to do in keeping up with all of this, intervening where needed. We mustn't stifle innovation. It's a very important source of consumer benefits. But, there may be areas where intervention is needed to avoid some of the pitfalls. I mean, AI, for example, being used for negative outcomes, not just beneficial outcomes. There are also, some examples I'll come on to maybe later where the regulator can play a role in coordination. Harking back to some of the themes from this morning's session, which I thought were really interesting, where regulators can play really important sort of coordination roles and making sure everything's on track, doing the same thing, having the assurance that everything's going to happen together, and when you get there, you're going to have a market for your goods. A lot of innovations don't progress because of those sorts of uncertainties. Regulators can and have, and I can go into a couple of examples later, play a really important role there, as well as the two Diane talked about this morning.
Yeah, let's actually zoom in a little bit just to focus the conversation on payments a little bit more. You see, only this week, Apple announced this new way of one phone talking to another and doing this very quick transactions, which is kind of weird. Where I sit in Brussels, there's still a fascination for coins and notes, but I guess there's some tax reasons attached to that. But Helen, on the payment side, you talk about regulators not being too heavy-handed in terms of not stifling innovation. Do you think, just tell us a little bit about what you think is the thinking now? Are regulators mostly focusing on consumer protection and therefore risking maybe how we can be benefiting from this amazing technology? How do we strike a balance?
I think you're absolutely right. It's a balance to be had. Nobody wants to stifle innovation. It can offer huge benefits to users, and we don't want to stop that, but we want to avoid pitfalls where things can go wrong. The example I was going to talk about, which is a work in progress, I think, at the PSR, is developing instant payments as a retail payment method. So instant payments are when you transfer money between bank accounts, and you can transfer money to your friend or your mum or whatever effectively immediately. Here it sort of says it happens in 2 hours, but generally it's immediate. The idea is, an idea that the PSR is actively trying to promote, but it's not just the PSR. There's loads of people in the private players out there in the payment sector who are developing this, a lot of fintech involvement and so on. This is happening anyway, but there's a very important role for the regulator to coordinate this, help facilitate the multilateral agreements that are needed to get the standards, the rules, get it off the ground, but more importantly, that this happens in a way that protects consumers and users. There's two sides to every transaction: the payer, often a consumer, and payee, often a merchant. So we mustn't forget that. We're not just talking about people who buy things; it's also the people they buy from, the merchants. And here there's quite a lot of complex issues that come up. To name just two, there's very important competition aspects here because, in the PSR strategy, developing account-to-account payments into a retail payment method is seen as a potential competitor with cards. In the UK, Visa and MasterCard dominate card payments, not a whole lot of competition in that sector, long-standing concerns about that. There's the hope that account-to-account payments could compete with that, as we see indeed in some other countries. Sweden, Swish is well developed, Brazil has PIX. There's some international precedents here that this can be quite successful. But for that to happen, there are some key access issues to be addressed, in particular developing open banking further so that it really facilitates these types of transactions. So open banking is the system by which third-party payment providers can initiate the payment out of your bank account. Set that up and ensure that I have an account with Lloyds, that Lloyds actually carries out the instruction, even when it's a third-party fintech, for example, benefiting as the transactor there, that this actually happens. So important issues there for the commercial model and the payments that the fees involved in all of this system as well. So that's certainly to me very understandable as an access, a competition-based access issue. But then the other sort of big area where the regulator, I think, needs to be involved is consumer protection. At the moment, your bank transfers do not have much, if anything, in the way of protection. That may well change with some of the measures due to come in later this year, but at the moment, if you go and transfer your money to a retailer using a bank transfer, you won't find it easy to get that back. Contrast cards, where there's a very well-developed system, or direct debit, where there are protections of the direct debit guarantee. Because account-to-account payments weren't devised with all this in mind, that consumer protection regime is currently not there. So what are we going to do about that? I mean, this is all a work in progress. So I don't think there are clear answers yet. But this is an area where the regulator, by being involved, can both protect consumers, but also this should help build the service, give people confidence to use it. There are key adoption issues here as well. And by everybody getting some certainty about what these transactions are, what they're going to involve, and what happens when things go wrong, it should actually help build this service, not just hinder it. So I think I'm painting perhaps a slightly rosier picture of what regulators can do. I'm not saying they always get it right, but there are things the regulator can do here that can be really positive for a service that is beneficial to people.
Very interesting. And on what we can do, Eleftheria, you talked about sandboxes. And can you give us a little bit of the flavor of what you're doing and how it's going, and the challenges as well, which I guess connects to the earlier presentation that we had as well.
The Bank of Greece regulatory sandbox has launched 3 years ago. It's more new at our country. We are a small country, but the regulatory sandbox is a mechanism that enables participants to carry out small-scale testing for their innovative products and services that they will introduce in the market. We are the 90th country in the European Union that we have implemented this regulatory sandbox, so they can participate all startups, firms, and natural persons in order to test their innovative proposal. The main objective of the Bank of Greece regulatory sandbox is for the Bank of Greece to gain some more insight on these innovative solutions that are in the open market, and also we want to see if there are any gaps under our legislation that is under Bank of Greece remit in order to update it. And this is a dynamic procedure. So they can apply not only authorized companies that have a license from the Bank of Greece, but also non-authorized companies through the authorized companies, or they can obtain a license before they join the testing environment. And what we can say is that we can see a mature in order from the applying companies for the institutional framework that is existing in our country. And the regulatory sandbox involves 4 distinct phases. The one is the application phase. The other one is the preparation phase with the Bank of Greece, that we prepare all the testing plan. So they can come to test in the testing phase for 6 months, or they can also ask for an extension of 6 additional months. And we have the final phase where the startups will decide if they want to launch this service or this product in a broad scale or to terminate it. But what we see is that in order to avoid innovation fragmentation, we must cooperate very closely with all the startups, these authorized companies and these natural persons, in order to ensure that we'll have a proposal that is innovative enough and do not have many risks for the consumers.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting and very proactive. Is there a risk that some of these companies that are involved in the testing do the equivalent of greenwashing, more like tech washing, let's say, where they might want to seek exemptions or try and figure out a way with very clever lawyers to bypass the system? I guess, is it on your mind when you're dealing with this company?
Of course it is in our mind, but because our authorized companies, they have all the license in order to function, it's very clear all the steps that must comply in order to come to test in our environment. So we have not seen any of these...
any bad behavior?
Yes,
you haven't banned any practice or done anything against the company because you thought it was too risky?
At the moment, no. At this moment, no, because it's something new.
Okay.
But we monitor very closely and cooperate very closely with all these companies in order to clarify the rules and the current legislation that is under our responsibility and our competence.
Interesting. Okay, very good. Simon.
Well, so not really putting much on payments, but just coming back to innovation more generally, and in particular, dangers to adoption. So on the positive side, I think regulators have got levers they can pull, not just sandboxes. So one of the things that Ofgem does is it spends your money through bills. And one of the things that Ofgem has chosen, I think correctly, to spend its money on is a pot of innovation funding. So there's something called the Network Innovation Challenge, which is, from memory, over £600 million. So when you think about R&D money, that early stage, that is a lot of innovation funding, effectively paid for by all of us on our bills. And through that, companies can come up with innovative ideas that they wouldn't otherwise do. And actually, Ofgem, I don't know where they now stand, but has looked at similar issues. Should non-regulated companies have access to that funding? And there have been some really great success stories of things that have come out of that, although Ofgem is now really challenging that and saying, where is all this cumulative innovation funding going? And is it improving your ongoing efficiency? Have we seen any evidence of your ongoing efficiency improving over time? And let me just come to one of the barriers to regulatory innovation, and I like to call this, why is novel a four-letter word at the CMA? Okay, and so Ofgem made the argument in Rio 2, one of the things that Ofgem tried to do better was to say, we've given industry all of this funding, so the annual improvements in efficiency should now have gone up. And we are going to ask for that back. The cleaners, where Ofgem looked at the level of funding that it provided, looked at the amount of efficiency savings it would normally allow, and then adjusted them to account for the net present value of all this innovation funding that they've done. And because of the inherent issues of providing evidence to support that assertion, which I sympathise with the CMA for that, but because of that lack of evidence, Ofgem lost that on the CMA. So that's an example, I think, of the regulator probably trying to do the right thing for consumers. They'd given all this money, now they ask for something back. And I would say a difficulty in the regulators and appeal bodies taking risks. And just the very last thing I'd also say is that if you think about one of the key net zero steps we need to take, it's electrification of cars, getting people to adopt an EV. Why are people not adopting EVs? Range fear. It costs a range fear. Yeah? And range fear is all about, are there enough charging spaces? And one of the key risks that should be on Ofgem's risk register is Ofgem going to get the blame for a lack of EV charging points? Because you need to significantly upgrade the grid to make sure there's enough electricity to have all these really fast chargers. Yeah. And that really requires Ofgem. To be fair, Ofgem is largely doing this. You can debate enough or not much. They are allowing, in some cases, network companies to invest ahead of the demand that has emerged to allow space for the demand. Which shows the pressure that regulators... But if Ofgem gets that wrong, it will have spent money unnecessarily. It puts huge pressure on the regulators to get these judgments right.
Yeah, big bet. Okay, let's open up the floor for questions in the last sort of 5 minutes that we have. I guess you've only given a flavor of so many avenues and directions. Do we have any questions from the audience? But in that case, I do have a question, because we haven't really spoken about AI in great detail. And Helen, I want to go back to you and talk about how you see the landscape on AI. I saw in your notes you even had this point of hallucinations. Tell us a bit about, hallucinating as we wrap up the day.
Okay. This is probably at the moment less a regulatory issue in that, as far as payments regulator is concerned, it's not dictating to anyone what to do. But Absolutely. I'll come in a moment as to sort of one aspect comes in. But AI is now being used extensively in the payment sector by the private players because, machine learning offers a very useful way of improving an awful lot of predictive tasks. It can optimise routing of payments around sort of international payment systems, automate the authorisation process, the completion of transactions, reconciliation with people's invoices, so on. in fighting fraud, you'll find banks use AI to predict to identify anomalous transactions, and then they can take intervention like, phone you, is this really you, that kind of thing. They can do all of that better. I mean, that's more the sort of machine learning side of things. Gen AI is coming in and improving these chatbots that we find all too often maybe. I mean, but the more they can be personalised and tailored to you and your circumstances, the better they will be and more helpful and less annoying to the consumers.
Though they need to get better, right?
But it's getting better thing. I mean, I'm certainly no expert on AI. I wouldn't say I have any great knowledge of the technology, but, I understand, these large language models do make mistakes. They will write things, say things based on associations in text that are generally there, but they can do what's called hallucinating. And also this tends to get worse as the database of what it's learning from becomes itself partly generated through AI. I mean, we are in danger of all this sort of accumulating and building on itself, and this hallucination problem, as it's called, where, your model dreams up something that isn't reality, is detached from reality, can become worse. So I think in payments particularly, there are some big questions about the accuracy of the tools people are going to get. If we're going to start getting AI-based tools that are meant to be doing smart analytics of businesses or helping you with your customer service problems, so we do need them to be accurate and not be giving bad financial advice, because the potential downside when that goes wrong for individuals can be really big. So, that's something I think to watch. So I haven't yet heard of financial regulators doing anything about that specifically, but I think it's a watch this space, and this is where the demand to understand what's going on is important. The other aspect I did just want to say, a lot of this is going on in the private sector. I think the one thing that's important for the regulator is to try and get the incentives right for the private sector. And where we're seeing this now, I talked a bit about bank-to-bank payments and fraud earlier. Up until now, the incentives on the banks arguably aren't that strong because they're not under any obligation to refund people when their payments go astray or they've been scammed. So the PSR is bringing in measures. I mean, it originates in government legislation last year. Government wanted this to happen, although they've been recently criticising the details of how the PSR is proposing to do this. But by putting an obligation on banks to refund consumers when they are scammed, that will heighten the incentives of the banks and incentivise them to make the investments in better technology to identify fraud. I think the contrast between, we spend all the time bashing card providers, but on the other hand, they do their anti-fraud job quite well because they are refunding, and because they have to refund a lot of the transactions, they do a very good job of identifying the fraud and are stopping a lot of it. Compare that with what happens in the interbank payments. I don't think we see the same level of investment. Getting the incentives right is the thing that the regulator is doing by putting an obligation on banks to refund people when they get scammed, will make them invest more in technologies to fight fraud and to try and stop it happening. So hopefully, it was close to $500 million last year lost in app scams. Hopefully that number will come down through improving the incentives, and that's the kind of thing regulators can and do think about.
Interesting. Some food for thought as we wrap up the day. I'll just hand over to Simon and Eleftheria just for some quite quick final remarks before we go.
Just very last, I think you said something really, really important, which is that regulators can influence incentives, and I think that's something that the regulator needs to really think through. The regulator should be bold sometimes, and arguably bolder. But they should also be very careful about not sending the wrong incentives. Let me just take one really small example. Do regulators blame companies using 20/20 hindsight? Yes, sometimes they do. Okay, and if that's the case, and we get strict liability in AI, as we're hearing, then will a regulated company ever be brave enough to experiment because the regulator will punish them for getting it wrong? So, that incentive setting is a double-edged sword, and regulators, and to be fair, they think about this a lot, it's a fine line to walk in terms of what you're incentivizing correctly and what you're at the risk of incentivizing the wrong behavior.
Very good.
And okay, my final remark is for regulators is agility. I think that is the most important remark on this, because agile regulators could decrease bureaucracy so as innovators do not suffer. So if we enable effective data and information sharing and cooperation between international, national and subnational different regulatory bodies, this could ensure coherence between different regulatory approaches. If we identify, address any gaps or overlaps or barriers, we could avoid innovation fragmentation. And so my proposal on that is maybe to the creation of one-stop shop in order to facilitate coordination between the different regulatory bodies, and whenever appropriate, maybe it's good to have an adoption of a common and shared regulatory approach worldwide.
Brilliant. Helen, anything final?
I think,
No, very good.
Are we up to time? Yeah, we're past time.
Incentives and agility, really good. I hope you had a good day today. I hope you enjoyed, like I have, our discussions. And good luck and enjoy the rest of your day and the sessions tomorrow. Thank you very much.